Let me introduce you to a man I've been thinking about a lot recently. A comedian named Michael Cathers, who goes by the pseudonym Geechy Guy, after an incident when he was a teacher where he misheard a Japanese student call him crazy in their native language.
Crazy.
He dreamed of being a street performer and magician until he started comedy at the age of 19, and had a brief mainstream peak in popularity in 2011, after both performing on The Late Late Show with Craig Ferguson in January and becoming a quarter-finalist on the 6th season of America's Got Talent in July. I did recognize him after rewatching his AGT audition, but the way I had recently discovered him was actually from TikTok. One video that came up in my feed was an old Entertainment Tonight newscast Geechy had uploaded to his page, where we're told he had then recently performed an impressive feat.
Officials from the Guinness Book of World Records were in the improv audience for one particular comic. Geechy Guy set a new world's record for most jokes told in 1 hour. 676.
And yes, as it's been reported, Geechy got his own spot in the Guinness Book of World Records after telling 676 jokes in an hour in August of 1993, beating the previous record of 583, with the idea being suggested to him by his friend and then owner of the Improv Comedy Club in Las Vegas, Bud Friedman. Geechy Guy is seemingly very proud of having the record for most jokes told in an hour. If that video, his website bio, and the amount of times it's brought up whenever talking to or about him is any indication.
Tell me something interesting about yourself.
I am in the Guinness Book of World Records for telling jokes.
You are?
I told over 676 jokes in 1 hour one time.
Really?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
But after I saw Geechy's video in my TikTok feed, him bragging about it so nonchalantly gave me a wave of curiosity as to how official this record actually was. And from doing research about the history of this world record, I accidentally uncovered an interestingly scandalous story, filled with a surprising amount of confusion and logistical turmoil. This record was a massive draw for the dedicated subset of comedians who specialize in rapid-fire one-liners, so plenty of attempts have been made by many performers to achieve and keep the title. And I think that looking into the full history of this record will give us some important context and a good framework for investigating Geechy Guy's claims. So come along as I tell you the story of a couple people who told a lot of jokes in 1 hour, and hopefully find an answer as to why Geechy Guy apparently holds Schrodinger's world record. Probably the most famous person to hold the most jokes in an hour record would be British comedian and TV host Tim Vine. According to Guinness, he broke the record on October 7th, 2004, telling 499 jokes at the Soho Theatre in London. I quickly want to note that that is 177 less than Geechy's alleged record, but just ignore that, I'm sure something like that won't happen again. Vine had beaten the previous record set by Estonian comedian Erkki Koulu, who told 362 jokes in an hour on August 10th, 2002. Koulu also alleges he did 500 jokes in an hour in November of 1997, and it was reported that he did 505 jokes during an event in June of 2000, though seemingly neither of these attempts had been acknowledged by Guinness. Also, quick tangent, but I'd be remiss not to mention that the event was no joke called Grill Fest 2000. I found a TV documentary about the event while doing research, and it didn't show Koulu anywhere, but it did show the very out-of-place American Elvis impersonator they brought to the event. The documentary crew must have really liked this Elvis guy, cause he's the only performer to show up multiple times and have their entire performance played in full during the show. Point is, you find a lot of interesting stuff about culture looking into topics like this, like how everyone being mildly amused by Elvis impersonators in the turn of the millennium was apparently a worldwide phenomenon. Vine's record would be quickly broken a year later when Australian comedian Andrew Lehman, going under the name Lamo, told 549 jokes on May 25th, 2005, according to Guinness. Lehman would be the holder of the record for close to a decade, but there were a few notable attempts to overtake him in that time. On March 11th, 2009, Scottish comedian Kev Sutherland attempted to beat Lehman's record, while also raising money for the British charity Comic Relief in partnership with that year's Red Nose Day event. He didn't end up taking the record, but he did raise a significant amount of money. In May of 2011, Tim Vine allegedly made an attempt to reclaim the record. Nothing is archived about this specific performance, and it's unclear if he did beat Lehman's number, but from the way it's described in places it is talked about, Vine did something in order to break the rules and not qualify. The guidelines for what gets your attempt disqualified are left intentionally vague by Guinness, and this wouldn't be the last time someone would break these rules, but we'll get into more detail about that later. The final attempts to take Lehman's title were made by British comedian and writer George Valentine. He had actually uploaded both of his attempts to YouTube, one on December 5th, 2013, where he told 600 jokes, and another on January 14th, 2014, where he allegedly told told 1,000. These attempts also weren't officially approved by Guinness, but this example is still notable to the story, as even without officially outdoing his number of jokes, Lehman's record would be taken from him shortly after Valentine's attempt. In April of 2014, it was reported that Andrew Lehman's record for most jokes told in an hour had been retroactively disqualified by Guinness, and that the title had been returned to Tim Vine. In a statement by Guinness given to news outlets, they did confirm Lehman's record was overruled, but wasn't specific as to the reason he had been investigated, as well as confusingly implying he only held the record for a brief time, despite no acknowledgement from the company of any of the other attempts and Guinness's website saying he held the record this entire time. The reason for Guinness's decision was left for people to speculate, and one reason in particular would come to mind if they had been following the record's history, which was the strict guideline against cue cards. Multiple comedians were warned before their attempts about the use of cue cards by Guinness adjudicators, and in fact many of the previously shot down attempts were invalidated due to not having their jokes memorized. One of these instances being George Valentine. Those attempts also broke the rules by not being performed for a live audience, but that's not the important bit. According to Valentine, he actually wrote a complaint to Guinness in February about his attempt at 1,000 jokes being disqualified despite the record holder breaking the same guideline, which was what allegedly led to the investigation into Lehman's record in the first place and its eventual invalidation in March. Now at this point, the only thing that's unclear is why Guinness never disqualified Lehman for this beforehand, even though they were seemingly always quick to warn and penalize other comedians for the exact same violation. The best explanation I could come up with is that Guinness either added the cue card rule after Lehman got the record, or simply became more strict after more attempts at the record were being taken, and either way didn't feel the need to compare previous holders to the new standards until Valentine contacted them. But anyways, the title now once again belonged to Tim Vine, and the record wouldn't change hands again according to Guinness until Australian comedian Taylor Goodwin told 550 jokes on November 4th, 2014. The title still belongs to Goodwin to this day, but there are still a few more interesting attempts at the record left to talk about. In February of 2014, the Scottish financial services company Scottish Friendly announced that they would be sponsoring an event where their chief actuary, Donald MacLeod, would try to beat what at the time was Lehman's record. Since the event would be paid for fully by the company, all the money donated or made during it would be split between 4 different charities. MacLeod had no previous experience in stand-up or performance in general, and his only brush with comedy came when he decided to catalog a handful of the one-liners he would consistently post to Facebook into a series of joke books, from which the proceeds also went to charity. In interviews, he admitted that he was excited for the experience and optimistic about breaking the record, but also that he had no plans of this being more than a one-time thing meant for a good cause. And so, on March 5th, 2014, he would perform at the Rhino Room Club in Adelaide, and managed to beat the record by telling 580 jokes. Although, he didn't submit the attempt for approval by Guinness, and never intended to, but according to him, all his charitable efforts had raised over $400,000 by 2018. And finally, we have Indian comedian Korukonda Rangarao. Alright, future me here, I'm sorry if I mispronounced any of these things. I tried to check the best I can, but I am still, unfortunately, very white. Rangarao had achieved some notoriety before by telling jokes for over 35 hours in May of 2011, but since Guinness's record for longest single comedian stand-up show was 40 hours, achieved by Bob Marley, no relation, in September of 2010, the record was only acknowledged by the local record-holding institutions, like both the Asia and Indian Book of Records, as well as Coca-Cola's Indian equivalent to Guinness, the Limca Book of Records. So, as his newest effort to be recognized by Guinness, he would attempt to beat Andrew Lehman's most jokes in an hour record. And on September 29th, 2013, he actually managed to beat the record, telling 654 jokes at the Laughter's Fun Club at Visakhapatnam, and sent the recording of the attempt to Guinness for approval. Hi, future me again. It's actually Visakhapatnam. For some reason, English Wikipedia says that it's Visakhapatnam, but I just didn't bother to check any further than that to see if it was actually accurate. I thought it'd be so cool to say a bunch of foreign words I've never heard before in this video, but I messed it up in the most American way I possibly could. In the 2 years it took to hear back from Guinness, Lehman's record had been invalidated and Goodwin had overtaken Vine as the current record holder. But it was reported that in May of 2015, Korukonda's record had been accepted by Guinness, and a plaque was awarded to him by Andhra Pradesh's Human Resources and Health Ministers. But despite beating Goodwin's record in raw numbers and reports of the feat being recognized by Guinness, the record seemingly never changed hands, according to places where Guinness would catalog its holders. The record's page on their website never updated to include Korokanda's attempt, and in fact, the page would be removed from the site by the end of 2015, leaving Goodwin as the final acknowledged holder of the record by the establishment. Some places speculate that his record was disqualified for once again reading jokes off of cue cards, but that doesn't explain why Guinness gave him a plaque 2 years after his attempt before invalidating it instead of rejecting it immediately on that basis, especially after they already disqualified Lehman's record by that point. Either way, Korokanda's effort is the last example that shows us once again that Guinness's standards for if they acknowledge this record, and if so for how long, is outwardly very ambiguous, and confusing even to the people attempting to achieve the title for themselves. There were other attempts at the record, of course, but they either weren't that interesting, or didn't go anywhere, or were never even meant to be submitted to Guinness in the first place, so overall that was all the important moments in the history of the most jokes in an hour world record. It's been interesting to unravel the history of a world record in a field as surprisingly competitive as stand-up comedy, and one with this much logistical uncertainty from Guinness. But an important thing to note about this story is that Geechy Guy and his 676 joke record wasn't mentioned anywhere. Granted, a lot of the sources I found were made after Andrew Lehman got the record, so it would make sense for them not to need to look back at the history as far as the early 90s. But from all the sources I could find, even the ones specifically about the history of this record and the people who say they hold it but don't officially, Geechy Guy was never mentioned anywhere, and certain details about the other attempts throw even more doubt onto his claims. You'd think the closest we'd get to confirmation was the record being mentioned on Geechy's Wikipedia page, but the only sources they have for this claim are Geechy's own website bio and a now inaccessible newspaper archive. Although, to be fair, if this newspaper is directly reporting on Geechy attempting the record at the time, then it would confirm the story. Although I doubt that a Las Vegas comedy show would be directly reported on in the Milwaukee Journal. If we've learned anything so far, it's that Guinness's enforcement of this record has been confusing, and intentionally or not, there have been several attempts at the record that have never been officially recognized by the company. But Geechy's story isn't really comparable to those other examples, since every other attempt at the record has been readily reported on, but the only places that say that Geechy holds the record and made it into the books are Geechy himself and places that interview him directly or got their information third-hand. The closest we have is that Entertainment Tonight report, and something must have happened for that to be made, but the only way we can access it online right now is that out-of-context clip Geechy uploaded to social media. So clearly just scrounging the internet for any information I could find wasn't getting me anywhere, and if I needed to dig deeper into the story, I had to do something I never thought would be possible for someone in my position. Read a book. Virtually every Guinness World Record book since the 1970s have been scanned and uploaded to the Internet Archive, and I looked through every one from 1974 to 2017 to see if there was any acknowledgement from Guinness about the record or Geechy Guy I had missed. So, after looking through all of the main Guinness books I could, I did learn a few things. Like how the most jokes told in an hour record wasn't brought up incredibly often, and when the record changed hands, it wasn't announced in that year's issue. But when it was mentioned, it at least stayed accurate to Guinness's stance at the time, like their September 2010 issue saying that Andrew Lehman was the current record holder. In all the books I checked, there was never a single mention of Geechy Guy, but what I did find was an earlier, seemingly forgotten comedian that broke the record, and the story of his attempt is definitely worth mentioning. According to Guinness, the Spanish comedian Felipe Carbonell broke the record by telling 349 jokes on July 29, 1993. This was first mentioned in their October 1994 book, and the person whose record he had beaten was never stated, making him the earliest holder of the record officially acknowledged by Guinness, as well as making Geechy's absence more obvious, since if he did beat Felipe's record, this book would have mentioned that instead. This wasn't the first time Carbonell got a record with them either. In fact, he was pretty prolific, since he had broken 5 records related to comedy in his career. He had such a history with the institution that he became one of Peru's unofficial Guinness consultants, and through his time performing, had become a beloved comedian and actor in South America until his death in August of 2021. Carbonell's record would be broken officially by Elkie Kolu 9 years later, or allegedly by Geechy Guy in the next month. One detail of note is that the last acknowledgement of Carbonell's record was in their 1997 book, and their stance never changed in any book in between. I don't know how Guinness kept track of which records they adjudicated in the 90s, but even if it was a different system, when a record would be broken that quickly by that much, and with it being mentioned constantly in reference to that performer, you would think they'd at least correct the blurb about the record in the last 4 4 years. And also, if you remember, it was reported that the record Geechy beat was actually 583 jokes. There has never been anyone with the record before or after Geechy with that number of jokes, but it would be weird if a detail that specific was just made up. So unless an absolute madman beat Carbonell's score by over 200 in that at most 2.5-week period, but somehow this person's achievement was never mentioned anywhere, this just adds another confusing aspect to Geechy's story. Now, to be perfectly clear, all the setup about mystery and manipulation is just part of the hook for the video. I don't sincerely want to imply that Geechy Guy is maliciously lying about making it into a Guinness Book of World Records. Admittedly, at first it was a reasonable conclusion to make given all the inconsistencies with the story, and to be fair, there are still some that haven't been explained. But the more I look into this record's history, the more I start to think that the real explanation is that whatever Geechy did do was just another victim of Guinness's confusing handling of performance-based records like this. Here's another example to see what I mean. One of Felipe Carbonell's other records is for the longest stand-up performance by a single comedian, which he set in 1988 with 72 hours and in 1990 with 100 hours. These achievements were even published in official Guinness books. But if you look up the record nowadays, you'll see that Guinness says the longest stand-up set was performed in April of 2013 at only 40 hours. And the earliest attempt at the record you could find from tracing it back was by Tommy Tiernan in 2009 at 36 hours. With no mention of whose record he was breaking, as well as news publications and apparently the Guinness adjudicator for the event saying that the record had never been attempted before, even though it wasn't hard to find Carbonell doing 3 times Tiernan's hours 2 decades ago. And you'd think Guinness would need even less effort to find it since they're the ones whose job it is to keep the records. Obviously this is more clear-cut of an example, but it shows that there was at least some precedent for Guinness not being able to properly keep track of the early history of these records, in comparison to attempts they made after they switched priorities from cataloging novel events to anyone who wants a record and can afford an adjudicator. So despite there still being some weirdly inconsistent details about his story, what most likely happened is that Geechy Guy did perform 676 jokes in an hour in August of 1993, beating Felipe Carbonell's record of 345. But for years the record laid untouched until a new wave of people in the early 2000s told Guinness they did the most jokes in an hour, without the company remembering the record had already peaked in the 90s due to the methods for tracking records having changed since then. The ambiguity surrounding Geechy's record was more or less a byproduct of Guinness not being as organized a company as people believe. And the only somewhat scummy thing he's done is continuing to say he made it into the books and not correcting people when they claim Guinness still considers him the record holder. But once again, this is all my theory to justify how incongruent Geechy's claims are to the rest of the record's history given all the context I could find. This just as easily could be me giving plausible deniability to someone who never thought anyone would look into their masterful lie this deeply. But from what I found, Guinness being a mess and mishandling the early history of their records, and Geechy or his manager just using that confusion to stretch the truth of what did happen to market himself a bit makes the most sense. Granted, this theory is based on a pattern of behavior and not any direct evidence of internal changes at Guinness, and there are aspects to the narrative that this story doesn't explain and can still only be seen as little white lies, but I think it's much more reasonable to think of the answer as Occam's razor easy, like average bureaucratic mismanagement, rather than a 2-decade-long complicated yet easy to refute conspiracy. And either way, the story of this record shines a light on the other side of achieving world records that the average person usually never gets to see. Most people imagine the Guinness Book of World Records as, despite its extravagant branding, a professional institution that's determined to deliver accurate information on the outliers of human achievement. But although Guinness is the most official record-keeping organization, its reputation has begun to wane in recent memory. But a lot of people see this as a once competent company that only fell from grace recently, rather than them being bafflingly disorganized since the beginning. But my initial confusion can't be solely blamed on Guinness, as Geechy Guy undoubtedly embellished details about his record, claiming he made it into one of the books, that he beat the record of someone that doesn't exist, and letting other people saying he still holds the title, instead of using it as an opportunity to shout out other comedians with equally impressive achievements. Even with some tangible evidence of the record happening, like the Entertainment Tonight report, everything that Geechy has said about his record just causes more unnecessary suspicion. All of the misleading Geechy's done may make him look like a better performer in the short term, but all it's really doing is adding even more confusion to the history of a record that already has a shocking amount of scandal. But instead of this being a slam dunk on a performer who thought they could get away with lying about their achievements, the narrative has shifted into a company that's not good at record keeping despite their whole business model being recording achievements, and a comedian who did do something worth acknowledging but souring that achievement by insisting on bafflingly misrepresented details. But no matter if this video turns out to be enlightening journalism or just straight up slander, that was the investigation into Geechy Guy's most jokes in an hour world record. And listen, this was supposed to be a filler video, but it took like a month to make, so I can't make a bit at the end. If you like this video, be sure to like the video, and if you enjoyed it enough to watch more of my stuff, then be sure to subscribe. And I'll see you all in the next video.